for 2020, similar as in case of the previous 4 earnings conference calls due to the pandemic. Our conference is held in a video conference format. The Vice President for Finance, Mr. Marek Badowski, will be the host of today's conference, and during the Q&A session you will also have access to Mr. Dariusz Niemiec, the President of the Management Board of TAURON Wytwarzanie, Mr. Ronald Makieła, Executive Director for Controlling, remotely available, and Ms. Bastian Gola, the Executive Director for the Analysis at Polska Energia. My name is Marcin Lauer. I represent the Investor Relations team. As usual, the presentation will be conducted in Polish with simultaneous interpreting into English. After the broadcast, you can also listen to today's meeting via teleconference, and you can also ask questions via a form that's available on the website of our broadcast. Mr. President, have the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, 2020 was a year of a pandemic. As we can see on the slide that presents the operating data, this year versus last year, the volume of electricity distributed fell by 3%. It is for us a situation that hasn't happened for a number of years now. Especially difficult was the second quarter, where the drops were much larger, whereas at the end of the year, quarter 4, we will see it on the presentation, we saw the recovery of the volume of electricity distributed. EBITDA was higher 17%. The main driver behind it, a one-off effect, was the release of a provision for the equivalent for electricity in the total amount of 235 million PLN. The net debt to EBITDA ratio 2.5, a safe level. Let me remind you that the maximum level that is included in the covenants with the financial institution is 3.5. 2020 is also a year of lower production from coal-fired units. We can see here a decline by 15% versus last year, and a higher output from renewable energy sources by more than 40%. This year also we produced more coal, more hard coal, 20% more than last year, whereas the supply came down, dropped 4%, similar as the decline of electricity volume distributed. Quarter 4 alone looked a bit different than the entire year. It was better. You could see the economy is getting used or is adapting to the conditions related to the pandemic. The volume of electricity distributed went up by 3%. Production of electricity from renewable energy sources went up 35%, whereas also the electricity production by hard coal-fired units went up by 6%. Let me remind you that for the entire 2020 it fell 15%. EBITDA in Q4 alone was significantly higher, materially higher, 83% versus the same period of last year, the previous year. When we look at the macroeconomic environment of TAURON Group, it's worth mentioning that it was a special year. As you can see, looking at the graph showing the changes of the GDP rate in Poland, you could see that Q2 was a very difficult period of time. We could also conclude that based on the volume of electricity distributed, but in the subsequent quarter the situation was better. The industrial production sold even was rising at the end of the year, but it's worth mentioning that services suffered more from the pandemic. Manufacturing industry not so much. That's why the data that we are presenting look the way they do. Consumption electricity throughout 2020 went down versus the previous year 2.3%. The imports went up by almost 25%. It was at a record-breaking level. level, more than 13 terawatt hours. We are assuming that in the subsequent periods this electricity imports will be slightly lower. Production of electricity in Poland went down by 4%, mainly in terms of lignite and hard coal-fired electricity generation. However, the production from renewable energy sources went up, as well as the gas-fired units output went up. It's worth taking a note of a graph showing the CO2 emission allowance prices. In 2020, we were dealing with quite substantial volatility. In Q2, the prices went down to 15 euro, which from the level of 30 euro per ton. Later, the prices rebounded very quickly, and now we can see that in Q1 2021 we are dealing with quite a substantial increase, material increase of emission allowances prices, carbon prices, and we can see very strong growth. The previous years were showing also the upward trend of CO2 emission allowance prices. However, the latest quarter brings very fast growth, very high volatility, which has a major impact upon, material impact upon the operations of such groups as TAURON Group. Briefly, a few words about the financial results. 2020, I'd like to emphasize that the net profit that we are showing is first of all both in 2020 as well as in 2019 under a strong pressure of impairment charges related to the current carrying amount of the assets. Were it not been for the impairment charges, the net profit both in 2019 and 2020 would have been slightly more than 1 billion PLN. Positive. EBITDA adjusted, excluding one-off events. First of all, the release of the provision for the equivalent for electricity went up year over year 3%. In Q4 alone, EBITDA adjusted, excluding one-off events, went up 36%. Very significant increase of EBITDA. We will elaborate on the reasons for such a growth later on. The distribution segment invariably in 2020 was the most important segment contributing to EBITDA. It is 72% contribution to EBITDA. The EBIT is you can see an important impact of impairment charges. In Q4 alone, you can also see the major role played by the distribution segment. However, Q4 2019 was very special due, first of all, to the one-off events. Therefore, the structure looks a bit different. Now, let's talk about the reasons for EBITDA growth in 2020. When we compare EBITDA year over year, the segments that contributed to the increase, first of all, the distribution segment, mining and supply segments. The segment had a negative impact upon the EBITDA was the generation segment. And in Q4 alone, basically one should say that all segments had a positive impact contribution to EBITDA, with the biggest contribution coming from the supply segment, mining and generation segments. The distribution segment in 2020 is first of all the release of a provision for the equivalent for electricity in the amount of 425 million PLN. The balance of that amount, 535 million, was released in other segment, was taken into account in other segments. And an important change regarding both the volume of electricity distributed as well as the structure of the volume. We are showing to you here minus 164 million PLN. The impact of volume itself was the impact of the price is very positive, almost 400 million almost on EBITDA. The impact of the price can be split into two major components. The first one being the impact of of the price related to the fact that the distribution tariff in 2019 was approved or was in force, was effective starting from April 6th. So the first quarter of 2019 practically was based on the 2018 tariff, and as compared to 2020 tariff, the average price for that reason is higher in 2020. And additionally, the structure of the electricity distributed has changed. Practically in all tariff groups, the volume went down except for one group, the G group, namely the households. This also has a major impact upon the total level of the average price. That's such a significant impact of the price upon EBITDA. Also important is the impact of grid losses, 106 million PLN. It was related to two factors. The first one being, of course, the price of electricity, which was higher in 2020 versus 2019. The price of electricity to cover the grid losses. And the other important element was also the higher level of those losses due to the change of the volume of electricity distributed. More volume we were supplying to the low voltage segment, which by nature leads to an increase of the grid losses. Q4 alone in distribution segment, EBITDA very similar versus the previous year. The price didn't have such a major impact as for the full 2020, because Q4 alone is the recovery of the volume. You can see the volume had a positive impact upon the EBITDA, and we also had a higher volume overall. So this is the situation showing to us that our consumers adapted to the situation caused by the pandemic. Looking at the key parameters, one should note the improvement of interruption duration and frequency of interruptions. The new grid connection installation time very similar versus 2019. All of those parameters are, of course, the parameters at such a level that is safe due to the regulations imposed by the President of the Energy Regulatory Office. We do not expect any adjustment, correction of the tariff in the subsequent periods. The regulatory asset base of the assets is growing over time. We are also expecting the increase of the regulatory asset base in 2021. Moving on to the next segment, the renewable energy sources segment. One should note, first of all, that in 2019 we acquired wind farms with a total capacity of 180 megawatts. Those wind farms are on the balance sheet of TAURON Group starting from beginning of September 2019. That's why when we compare the production output, we differentiated between the output of wind farm Ekoenergia. So we up to now, the thus far wind farms held by the group, and the newly acquired wind farms. In total, we were dealing with a significant increase of the production output, which was mainly related to the acquisition of wind farms. Therefore, the production went up by more than 40%. Also, the production from hydroelectric power plants was very good last year due to the favorable hydrological conditions. Not in the beginning of 2020, but further on, later in the year, those conditions improved significantly, and which meant that we were able to produce more electricity from hydropower plants, which had a major impact upon two components: marginal electricity or property rights. Those two components are related, first of all, to the increase of production from the renewable energy sources. Q4 alone in the renewable energy sources doesn't show such substantial increases due to the fact that in the new wind farms, the new acquired wind farms in 2019 were already in operation throughout Q4. You can see a clear improvement with respect to the output of the hydropower plants, almost double the production output, which was related to the favorable hydrological conditions in 2020, and very You can see also very comparable output, similar output from the wind farms in Q4 alone. In generation segment, one should note, first of all, what I already brought up at the very beginning, the rising prices of the CO2 emission allowances prices. If we compared the price of electricity in 2020 obtained by the generation segment versus 2019, that price is to a very small degree higher. It's about 4 PLN per megawatt hour. However, the price of carbon credits that we use to cover the obligation in 2019 was 66 PLN per megawatt hour. In 2020 is 98 PLN per megawatt hour, so a very material increase by 32 PLN per megawatt hour, which has by naturally an impact upon the deterioration of the margin. We are showing it in the first bar, but we are showing margin on electricity. This is the main reasons for the deterioration of the EBITDA in that segment. Simply, the price of electricity does not reflect the rising prices of CO2 emission allowances prices. Why it's not reflecting? For two reasons, as a matter of fact. First of one being the fact that imports went up significantly, and the second one is the increasing share contribution of renewables to the energy mix, which means that the correlation between the electricity price and the CO2 emission allowance prices is getting weaker and weaker, and this naturally has an impact upon the earnings in that segment. In case of the biomass-fired units, this margin is a bit better, but this is related to first of all to the market condition, and one should clearly say that the biomass-fired units are those units for which the most important thing is the price relationship between the price obtained on the market and the biomass cost. If the biomass price goes up very strongly, then this production becomes unprofitable, and this relationship is most important. Nowe Jaworzno, the 900 megawatt units, has been in operation since November 2020, so partially we are showing this result in the generation segment in 2020. In 2020 we also swapped the contracts for the CO2 emission allowances purchases. We sold it on the market. We purchased under contracts with financial institutions. The sales and purchase price were a bit different, so overall we recognized a loss in that transaction, but this loss will be accounted for as the time goes by. In 2020 this loss is almost a little bit less than 80 million PLN. In Q4 alone 2020, as I mentioned, the 910 megawatt unit is in operation, so that's why we are showing the positive impact of this unit on the result, the profit of generation segment. Here also the CO2 emission allowance prices are important, but if you compare the price of electricity in Q4 alone, it went up. It went up by 20 PLN per megawatt hour. The prices of CO2 emission allowances, or the cost of purchasing the carbon credits to produce electricity, went up by 26 PLN. So one may say that in Q4 alone this correlation was better. In terms of what was happening on the electricity market, one should highlight another factor, namely in the case of a pandemic, when the entire economy found itself facing the lockdown, which led to the unprecedented situation. It suddenly turned out that many market participants are simply over-contracted. Too much electricity was purchased. It was simply redundant due to what's happening on in the economy, and the price of electricity went down in Q2 alone. Also margins went down. They recovered later in the year due to the adaptation adaptation of the economy to the pandemic situation. This also had an impact upon our situation, our position. As you can see clearly in Q4, in the generation segment, we have a lesser impact of the market-related factors. In the supply segment, one should note one very important element, namely the buyback, the repurchase of electricity, because in 2020, for the majority part of the year, the 910, the new unit was not in operation. We contracted earlier the sale, supply of this electricity, therefore we were buying back, repurchasing this electricity on the market. Also the Stalowa unit was not also in operation for the majority of the year, and also we were buying back electricity on the market. And this led to a positive impact in the total amount of 335 million PLN, and it's also worth noting that this is clearly a one-off event. Now both units are in operation, and the EBITDA will be included, except for the Stalowa Wola unit, because we are not including the Stalowa Wola unit in EBITDA, but 910 unit's result will be included in the generation segment. We are expecting generally that the 910 megawatt unit in Jaworzno will be generating EBITDA for full year at the consolidated level in the amount of between 250 and 300 million PLN. In the supply segment, we also were dealing with slightly lower volume of electricity supplied, as well as the higher change of the structure. In this case, a positive change of the structure, change of the composition, and in terms of the margin volume, we are showing that the impact was positive. One more thing should be highlighted here, namely the issue related to the onerous contracts. We will show it on the next slide when we are showing Q4 alone. In Q4 alone, in the supply segment, we are showing quite a significant positive impact, because in 2019 we set up a provision for onerous contracts related to the costs that are not covered by the tariff approved by the President of Energy Regulatory Office. In 2020, let me remind you, the tariff didn't cover full cost. In 2021, it covers the full cost, but in 2022 it didn't cover. So that's why we set up a provision. In 2020 we didn't set up a provision. We set up a small provision for losses related to the prosumers. That's why quite a material impact of that factor. The lack of provisions in 2020 set up, while in 2019 such provisions had been set up. And moving on to the mining segment, ladies and gentlemen, here one can say we are dealing with a festival of positive factors that improved our earnings in that segment. That's true. In 2020 the situation is much better in terms of production. The unit cost, mining cash cost, went down quite substantially, whereas 2020 is first of all the year we were dealing with a high coal inventory levels, which is the consequence of what I mentioned before, namely it is the consequence of generally a decline nationwide, not only in TAURON Group, but a decline of hard coal-fired production, and this is reflected in the change of the inventory level, which we are showing here. One may say in demonstrating the cost of producing coal on the inventory level. Once the inventory is consumed, is used, sold, then this effect will be reversed. Of course, the scale of this effect is depending upon the price of the coal, and then we will see what's the impact of the sale of inventory on the EBITDA result. The other factors had a positive impact. Let me draw your attention to one: the financing under the anti-crisis shield, 47 million PLN. This was the consequence of the fact that for 3 months the workforce of the segment of TAURON mining subsidiary subsidiary had a reduced working time and reduced wages, and at the same time we received the financing under the anti-crisis shield, and that led to quite a significant improvement of the EBITDA, which of course is not at an unsatisfactory level, negative level, but it's quite a significant improvement versus 2019. In Q4 alone, the situation is very similar. In the other in the graph, in the bar other, we are showing the impact of the one-off events that took place in 2019 but didn't occur in 2020. And ladies and gentlemen, the discontinued operations, this is the TAURON heat subsidiary. It is being reported as discontinued operations because at the end of 2020 it was a company held for sale, subsidiary held for sale, due to the fact that after the balance sheet date, after the end of 2020, the bidder or the potential bidder, PEGNI company, stepped back from the transaction. We took action, so we are conducting now analysis what to do next with this line of business. However, as of the end of 2020, this company, this subsidiary was held for sale. That's why we are placing it in the reporting as discontinued operations, although of course these operations are continued. In fact, here EBITDA is very similar year over year, 2020 versus 2019, in spite of the fact that in 2020 the situation regarding the temperature, outdoor temperature, was definitely less favorable than in 2019. Nevertheless, here the EBITDA was maintained. Let me draw attention to one element: margin electricity here. Of course, the increase of the prices of CO2 emission allowances. In this case, in the case of electricity generation by TAURON heat subsidiary, this increase is a bit smaller. This is several dozen %, of course, but this is quite material and has a material impact upon the reduction of unit margin. Q4 alone at TAURON heat, we saw the earnings improve quite substantially, quite materially. We are showing here the most important elements in the other segment. The other segment, first of all, the release of a provision with 15 million PLN. Practically half of that amount is a one-off event, the release of the provision. And ladies and gentlemen, let me move on to the debt and financing topic. Now I'd like to mention that at the end of 2020, the company of the TAURON Group, TAURON Capital Group, had available financing of 3.4 billion PLN financing available. Let me remind you that the net debt to EBITDA ratio is 2.5. Looking at the maturity of our debt, you can clearly see that this year, 2021, there is not so much repayment of debt. However, in the subsequent year, we have to repay a large bond issue program originated in 2015. At this point in time, we are conducting works, we are making analysis, we are talking to financial institutions how to approach this. We are looking also for a good solution in terms of timing when we were to take up some actions, due to the fact that we know that the situation is quite specific, quite special. We have a pandemic in the back of our minds all the time, so we are hoping that the vaccination program will be conducted efficiently, and the dates, the timeline provided will enable us to approach the maturity, the bond issue maturity repayment date in 2022. Moving on and discussing briefly in CapEx, in the structure of the capital expenditures, the distribution has a larger share. Generation had also its large share in 2019 and 20, but once the 910 megawatt unit was commissioned, the capex in the generation segment will be smaller than in the previous years from now on. We are also assuming that there will be more and more capex in the renewable energy sources, but we must remember these are often projects that require also time, and therefore we don't have such spectacular projects to show here in 2020. However, the works are underway all the time regarding this topic. Looking at the prospects, the outlook, 2021 outlook, in our 5 segments, 5 lines of business, it's worth noting that the distribution segment, if we adjust the earnings, excluding the one-off events of 2020, primarily the provision for 30 billion PLN, provision for electricity equivalent, we expect EBITDA to be flat. We are very happy with the fact that the President of the Energy Office maintained the WACC at the level of 2020, namely in this segment we are dealing with a stable situation. Of course, this WACC, we would like this WACC to be higher, but I think that the risk that we were also raising a number of times that the WACC will drop, it did not materialize, so it's a positive piece of information. We expect the increase of the regulatory asset base, also the volume of electricity distributed should be higher. We can see it based on what we have been observing since the beginning of this year, so a slight decline of the distribution tariff should not have an impact upon the EBITDA generated in this segment. In the renewable energy sources segment, we are expecting a decline of electricity production, worse weather conditions that in 21 than in 20, the same worse hydrological conditions, therefore we expect a decline of production which should have an impact upon the decline of EBITDA, but here there's always a chance that the weather conditions will be better, will be more favorable. Anyhow, some of our sources lost the support system due to the period of their operation, and in this segment we are expecting that in 2021 we will not be dealing with a large increase of installed capacity. Of course, all the time and even recently we were communicating this the commissioning of a Choszno photovoltaic farm in Jaworzno in 2020, but these are amounts in the region of 5-6 megawatts. In the general segment, we expect a substantial increase, mainly to the operation of a 910 megawatt unit in Jaworzno. As I mentioned, in 2020 we were buying back electricity on the market. In 2021 we will be showing this result in the generation segment, because this unit is in full operation. We are expecting the 680 million PLN of revenue from the capacity market. However, one should remember that we don't have any more of a operational capacity and coal intervention reserve cap mechanism, so the total impact upon EBITDA is in the region of almost 400 million PLN. And we expecting also difficult market situation. The increase of the carbon credit prices doesn't make us optimistic regarding the hard coal-fired units. In the supply segment, we expect EBITDA, adjusted EBITDA to be stable, to be flat, after we exclude the EBITDA generated from the buybacks of electricity, the total 340 million PLN of EBITDA coming from those buybacks of electricity in 2020. We assume the full coverage of the costs by the G tariff will not lead to the deterioration of the situation. This is a positive piece of information for us. And we're also assuming that in 2021 we will be dealing with a substantial increase of capacity, power of prosumer installations. This has a negative impact upon the EBITDA generated by that segment. In conclusion, we expect EBITDA to be flat versus the previous year. In the mining segment, we also expect EBITDA to stay flat. Unfortunately, achieving a positive EBITDA would be a surprise. First of all, due to the fact that on one hand we are dealing with a higher hard coal volume that we produce, but we're also dealing with a lower price. The lower price is first of all related to the inventory levels that we have in Poland overall. There's a lot of coal, and reducing those inventory levels, taking into account the market situation, the prices of CO2 emission allowances, will take time. So, therefore, this level of inventory increases the pressure on coal price reduction, and this will be the main challenge in the mining segment, so the sales. Overall, the group's EBITDA should be comparable versus last year after excluding the one-off events. The consensus published by the Bloomberg indicates 3.7 billion PLN EBITDA. We feel comfortable with this level. We assume that the capex will be adjusted to the EBITDA level, so will be lower than in 2020. The debt and the leverage ratio, of course, here we expect the situation to be stable. We cannot exclude the leverage ratio to be higher than at the end of 2020, but it will still be safe, below the level that is allowed under the contracts with the financial institutions, so below 3.5. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's all in terms of the presentation part. Thank you very much for the presentation. As I expect, one should associate with the fact that we published the full year earnings, so the broadest information that we disclose, so that's why we got such an unprecedented high number of questions that we received. We will try to answer the maximum possible number of those questions, but in case if within the time frame of our earnings conference we are not successful at that, I will ask you to get in touch with our investor relations team, and we will try to get back to you with the answers to your questions. But without any further ado, let us move on to the questions themselves. Mr. Michał Kozak from the brokerage house Trigon is asking about the most probable scenario of a bank's approach to the spin-off of mining assets, whether the mining net debt will be taken off the balance sheet of TAURON. Let me answer this question. Of course, we would like that to happen, of course, to materialize this situation. The concept of spinning off the coal assets is a concept that the Ministry of State Assets is working on. It is not yet completed. Of course, we are counting on the positive approach of the financial institutions to such a concept. However, we do realize the fact that this definitely is a challenge. I think that we need to wait a little bit longer to finally find out what could be the scenario for spinning off the coal assets, the mining assets, but definitely it is in our interest for this debt to be taken off the balance sheet of TAURON. Of course, the question is in what amount. Thank you very much. The question about the volume of coal extraction planned for 2021. For 2021, our planned coal extraction volume is slightly more than 5 million tons. A more detailed question regarding the gas sense, what the gas units and whatever. I'd like to answer this question, Mr. Director Sebastian Gola, to answer this question. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. In terms of answer to this question, I would. This project related to the gas engines project was split into two sections. The first one envisioned construction of about 5 megawatt capacity gas-fired engines in Brzeszcze. They were submitted to the capacity auction for 2021. We managed to get additional bonus due to the low emissions, and the total revenue from 17-year contract that we concluded under this auction was about between 17 and 19 billion, depending upon the million how this will be in the another stage was around another 5 megawatts. This project will be completed in 2021, so we took part in the main auction, additional auction for 2021. We were planning to take part in the additional auctions up to 2024. We also conducted those units for the period of 15 years under the 25 auction. So we have several years under contract at the prices that materialize under those auctions. This is the revenue of another 15 million. So such an estimated total revenue from the 10 megawatt investment in the entire capacity market period is about 30 plus million and more, depending upon how the price of the capacity market will be indexed by the President of the Energy Regulatory Office. Thank you very much. Thank you. Next question is regarding the need to set up the provision in the renewables segment. What are the current plans regarding the TAURON heat? The CAPEX plan for 2021. What about the green turn of TAURON strategy versus the plans of a potential purchase of some assets of ČEZ in Poland and no sale of the TAURON heat subsidiary assets? So several topics under this question, so let me go one by one. Okay, the provisions in the renewable segment we set up, of course, I don't know if I give you a full answer to this question, because I assume that this is the provision you're referring to. In 2020, we set up a provision due to the real estate tax. This is related to the ruling of the Constitutional Tribunal of July 2020 regarding the incompatibility of regulations, backdated regulations coming into effect, considering the structures, technical parts of wind farm plans that was introduced in 2020. Generally, it is the matter of this real estate tax on the structure, which was cleared in 2020, but this is related to the fact that during the tax year we changed the tax regulations, and the ruling of the Constitutional Tribunal determines that this is not in compliance, and you cannot backdate the tax regulations. The total provision amount is 17 million PL, and of course now there is an exchange of correspondence underway with the municipalities. However, the tax situation is practically clear. It's a one-off event related to the ruling of the Constitutional Tribunal. The plans regarding the TAURON heat subsidiary, at this point in time we are reviewing those plans, because if we are not able to finalize the deal due to the lack of interest of potential bidders, we are thinking what's next, what to do with the heat segment. Here, a very important element is, of course, the emissions levels of the sources. TAURON heat is mainly based on the hard coal-fired sources, so therefore it's not possible not to assume in the future the upgrade, the modernization of those sources to turn them into low-emission sources. The natural choice would be here the natural gas, which could over time be replaced with hydrogen. And that's why we are looking into various options and the amounts of required capex regarding this project, with such projects. We must be aware of the fact that generally the heating this segment in Poland faces a lot of challenges. It's a big question mark how it will be financed in order to bring about substantial increase of heat prices in Poland. This is the situation today. We are analyzing the situation. We haven't taken a decision yet. The CAPEX plan for 2021, as I mentioned already, we assume it's not going to be more higher than the EBITDA level, and I think the Bloomberg consensus level is the level that we feel comfortable with. Of course, we will see yet how the implementation will be progressing. We don't have all the investment project-related tenders resolved yet, but this is, I think, the order of magnitude. So generally it will be lower, CAPEX will be lower than 2020. And now the CES assets, that we are interested in, are assets that are located in the direct neighborhood of TAURON heat assets. Therefore, we assume in case of a district heating network, we might be dealing with a lot of synergies. We are not interested in Skawina. This is an asset that's located in Krakow, and we don't have a plan to expand outside the market that we are already serving. So I'm talking about the TAURON heat subsidiaries market. If it turns out that the terms that we could acquire those assets and could be profitable and attractive for TAURON Group, of course we'll provide this information. As of today, we haven't made a decision yet. We are conducting an analysis, a review, how TAURON heat subsidiary could operate in an optimum manner in the future, taking into account the challenges that the company is facing. Thank you very much. Next question regarding the assumed shrinking of a margin in the generation segment due to the increase of the carbon credit prices in 2021. Will the revenue from the capacity market will cover the decline of a clean dark spread in the generation segment? I'd like to ask Mr. Sebastian Gola to answer this question, please. As we already mentioned in the previous part of the presentation, the main factor that degrades the profitability of the generation segment starting from this year is primarily the increase of the carbon credits, but also the liquidation of such mechanism as the operational capacity reserve or the cold intervention reserve mechanism. The market factor that shows the decline of the margins generated by the coal-fired units, mainly the 200 megawatt unit. This has been observed since 2019. In 2020, we were dealing with a big decline of those prices, mainly due to the COVID pandemic and the record-breaking warm winter and the low demand for electricity. This year the margins are still not very good if you look at the unit per unit result, but looking from the group-wide perspective, you should look at the first-degree margin generated by our generation units, the total margin, and just like the capacity market was to play the role that involved the compensating the lost revenue from the electricity market with capacity market payments. That's how it works in TAURON. We can say that a large portion, maybe in the whole, the capacity market provides a compensation due to the decrease of production output and the margins. Thank you very much. The next question is related to the impact of electricity sale to TP for the electricity sale agreement on the supply segment's results. I'd like to ask Mr. Roland Makieła to answer this question, please. The purchase of electricity on the 910 MW units on the TAURON Polska Energia earnings in Q4, the result was 61 million PLN in Q4. Thank you very much. Next question is related to the participation of TAURON Polska Energia in the nuclear program. Are there any details related to that issue? Let me just brief you inform and remind you that very recently, over the last few days, the shareholders of PGE EJ1, apart from TAURON, Polska Energia, PG, KGHM and Enea, the shareholders sold those shares to the state treasury. So as of today, one may say that the role, the participation of utilities, electric utilities in this project has been completed. Next question is related to the guidance regarding the net debt to EBITDA ratio. Why should it go up if the adjusted EBITDA is to be flat and the capex should be lower? Well, here, first of all, one very important element should be taken into account, namely the release in 2020 of a provision for the electricity equivalent in the total amount of 537 million PLN. If now we make such an assumption that the net debt to EBITDA ratio at the end of March, at the end of June, we calculate, compare it versus the EBITDA generation over the last 12 months. Still at the end of March, it will not go up. The ratio will not go up due to the fact that we will be still including recognizing this one-off event because it occurred in Q2. However, as of the end of year 2021, this one-off event will not be included, will not be recognized anymore. I think very briefly that's how you could summarize that. Next question is related to the negative impact of expiration of the support for power plants and the wind farms for 2021, year over year. I'm not able to tell you for 2021, but I can answer as follows. In 2020, the support expires starting from September, and the impact was the decline of EBITDA by 7 million PLN. So maybe you could extrapolate it for the entire 2021 based on this number. Thank you. The next question is, what is the adjusted EBITDA in the mining segment for 2020? In the mining segment, this EBITDA, in fact, we should adjust by including 60 million PLN. These were one-off events. Of course, we can adjust it in different ways, for instance, by changing taking into account the change of the inventory level, but you're showing this in the presentation, the impact of that factor. But as a matter of fact, the one-off event is the 60 million PLN. This is the write-down in 2019, the cost incurred when working on the minings and the headings, 2019, but for that reason we are showing the improvement of the EBITDA in 2020. However, in 2020 alone, if you look formally at the EBITDA amount, then such one-off events practically are not included. So one can look at this EBITDA as being the adjusted EBITDA. We have a question regarding the impact in 2020 related to ensuring, providing the distribution and storage of electricity for the prosumers. And an analyst is asking, where is it shown in the results, in the earnings? I'd like to answer Mr. Director Roland Makieła this question.
Jeśli chodzi o wpływ rynku prosumenckiego, jego dynamicznego rozwoju, może tylko dla przypomnienia wspomnę, że ilość czy wartość mocowanych z tytułu instalacji prosumenckich opartych o promieniowanie słoneczne, generację promieniowania słonecznego, to na koniec roku 2019 była to wartość 1 gigawata, na koniec już 2020 aż 3 gigawaty, czyli mamy przyrost 2 gigawatów w ciągu jednego
we are talking about a 2 gigawatt increase within 1 year, so the impact of the value of that impact in Q4
ona wyniosła 13 milionów złotych,
13 million
a w całym roku
for the
2020
entire
była to
2020 it
wartość
was
równa 31 milionów,
equal to
31 milionów złotych.
million PLN.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Bardzo dziękuję.
Thank you. Question about the cooperation with Polish Mining Group, PGG. What is the level, the amount of coal not picked up 2020? Will TAURON have to buy back the coal that it didn't pick up in 2020? In this case, all the time we are conducting an exchange of correspondence with the Polish Mining Group regarding this topic. In our opinion, the entire coal for 2020 was picked up actually by TAURON Capital Group, because at the end of the year, also at the end of January, we made a depository purchase of that coal in order to settle, to make settlements and reconciliations for 2020, and to bring about a situation where we don't have any claims regarding those reconciliations. Unfortunately, the exchange of correspondence is still underway because the position of the Polish Mining Group is a bit different in this regard. However, due to the deposit type purchase and the contractual volumes, amounts for 2020 were fully picked up by TAURON Group. Thank you. As you can hear, the scope of questions is very extensive. The questions are dealing with all the lines of business of our group. The next question is related to the volume produced by the 910 megawatt unit that's been produced since the commissioning of that unit. I'd like to ask Mr. President Dariusz Niemiec to answer this question. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In terms of the production output by the 900 megawatt unit, since the commissioning date, as of the end of March, it produced about 1.25 terawatt hours. But one has to note it's still infancy period, so during that time a number of tests, adjustments were carried out, scaling as well as troubleshooting. So this production was the resultant of our sales plans as well as the occurrences, the development that I already mentioned. Thank you very much. Thank you. The next question is related to the hedging of electricity prices for 2021 and CO2 as well. What is the level of hedging for 2022? I'd like to answer this question. Mr. Director Sebastian Gott, answer this question. Regarding 2021, then in accordance with the contracting strategy, one may say that the generation assets are contracted almost 100% before the year of the delivery of the production of that electricity. So here the answer is yes, we have a full 100% hedging for prices. Practically the result is already secured. Of course, on the spot market, depending upon the situation, the balancing situation and the demand, there are times where we can additionally contract certain units, and we are also taking advantage of such circumstances. Regarding the subsequent year, 2022, here the level of contracting is dependent upon our strategy. I don't want to speak about detailed numbers because this is the result of our planned approach to the contracting of those assets. We are trying to follow a certain scheme regarding that. First of all, the highest efficiency, so the lowest variable cost units are contracted. So first of all, the you just mentioned NJGT, that guarantees the 100% hedging, but due to the CDS and the prices that you observe today, the other units are progressively contracted, and this progress is strongly dependent upon the strategy that we are based upon the market conditions. Thank you very much. The question more of a general nature, what does TAURON expect from restructuring of the mining sector? Does the company assume that at least 2 coal mines will be handed over? And the question regarding the plan of extraction for 2021 was already addressed. However, there's another question related to that regarding the merger of the coal mines, and can the company reduce the headcount? Well, let me answer this question. The works underway regarding the final shape of social contracts regarding the mining, hardcore mining sector. Of course, TAURON Wydobycie, TAURON Mining subsidiary is a company that's involved in those works, and as part of those works, we are making following assumptions that Janina and Sobieski coal mines will be merged together. We assume that this may take place in 2021. We expect that such a merger will help us optimize the operations of those coal mines, thanks to the possibility to reduce the assets, improving the production levels. So there's a number of factors in place. Also geographically, those coal mines are located close to each other, at least the mining areas are located close to each other, and that's why this merger makes sense. Can we reduce the headcount? Let me remind you that TAURON Mining subsidiary continuously is reducing its headcount. Of course, not in a kind of step way, the way that we were doing a few years back, thanks to certain legislative solutions, but over time, through the lack of new recruitment, the retirements, the requalifying, of course, the extension of the process will be possible, of course, provided that it's enabled by the social agreement. So as far as what it will look like in the future, we still need some time to wait for that. But what's important is the fact that the concept of restructuring the entire sector was presented to the social partners, and that concept includes an assumption that most probably the mining assets will be excluded will be spun off out of TAURON Group into another entity, and that other entity will be able to take advantage of a notified public aid. This is the concept as of today. We will see whether this concept is defended at the European Commission level, because let us remember, it's not a simple thing to develop, to work out the ultimate concept to be agreed upon with the European Commission. We do believe, we do hope that this process can be conducted efficiently, and that the European Commission looks favorably at what is happening in Poland, looks with a favorable way at our wish to change the shape of the sector, so that on one hand to decarbonize the energy sector, on the other hand to ensure the energy security, was a process that's very important. This energy security must be, first of all, a very important element, because in such cases as we were dealing with this year, the lack of shortage of electricity supply could have had very major consequences. So it's a multifaceted process, so therefore we will be working on it, and we are definitely in favor of such restructuring of the mining sector, that it happens, that we can speak afterwards about the stable, good situation of the mining sector in Poland. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for all the questions that you sent. We also thank you for... We will try to get back to you with information regarding certain details that, due to the time constraints of our earnings conference call, will not be able to provide here. Already today I'd like to invite you to the conference after the Q1 report is presented. Taking advantage of this opportunity, let me also, on behalf of the entire team, to wish you a happy Easter. all as much as possible health, and please stay in touch in your daily work with our investor relations teams. Thank you very much.